Welcome to the third talk of English seminar series here at LUMS. We are very excited to have Saba with us. Saba Karim Khan is an author, award-winning filmmaker, and educator whose writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, Vocifery, HuffPost, Dawn, among other publications. She graduated on the Dean's List with BS Honors in Social Sciences from LUMS. She has read social anthropology at the University of Oxford and works at NYU Abu Dhabi. Her debut novel, Skyfall, was recently published by Bloomsbury. Her documentary film, Concrete Dreams Some Roads Lead Home, has won multiple awards at the Global Film Festival circuit in Paris, Berlin, Toronto, USA, and India, and is now available on Amazon Prime Video. Before joining the academy, she worked as country marketing and public affairs head at Citigroup. Born in Karachi, she now lives in Abu Dhabi with her husband and two daughters. Thank you very much, Saba, for being here today with us. And
Thank you so much.
Skyfall is a beautifully written work, with those radical motifs and great attention to detail. So I'm thinking before we begin a conversation regarding that, it would be great if you tell us about Skyfall and what is it about.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Sadia. And I want to thank, Dr. Ali Khan and Dr. Farooq Khan as well for really being pivotal to this conversation and to so much more during my time at LUMS and post that. And maybe we can talk about that later. But this is a real honor and it feels like a real homecoming. I'm really excited. So as you said, Skyfall was released by Bloomsbury this past December. And it's set between Lahore, Delhi, and New York. And it's the story of a young girl who hails from these choked slums of Hira Mandi in Lahore and journeys all the way to New York in the quest to what I see as, the quest to unearth her song, and in the quest for sort of seeking justice in a world that is marred by borders and by, restricted movement and those sorts of things. And I think because I imagine a lot of the people here might not have read the book. So I just want to be very mindful of that as we talk about the book and kind of abstract from it. But I think the question that really motivated me and motivated the book was, what price do you pay as a girl, as a woman, as an other, as we're often cast? As anyone, especially hailing from the margins or what we see as the margins, when you dare to unearth your song and when you dare to transgress or ask uncomfortable questions. So I think that is really the spirit behind the book. And not a lot of people know this. It's funny because humorously, people will always connect it to the Bond film as far as the title goes. But Skyfall actually means the last attempt you make against a group of people when you're outnumbered. And I guess I was curious to kind of unpack what happens when you sort of go against the grain and when the odds are heavily stacked against you and you decide to give it that final pushback.
Hmm. Interesting. So, Saba, I guess my question is now, what is your song behind this song? What was your inspiration? What actually inspired you to create that story and also create that character of Ramin? Because, she's very complex, complicated, and also equally nuanced, brown, young, Muslim, Pakistani girl. So, how did you conceive that, and what is your song behind this entire narrative which you have created?
Yeah, well, I'll break it up maybe into two parts, Sadia, and I'll speak about Rania's character maybe in the second part of the response. But I'll react to what you asked me first, which is about my own song. And I think, just by way of a backstory, I grew up in a house where my father was a professor of English literature. And so we kind of grew up in an environment where English and Urdu literature and poetry and prose and all of that was very much part of my everyday embodied reality. And, he would talk to us about these three books that he'd scripted in his mind. And so I think, kind of at a more personal level, Abu's not there anymore, but I think Skyfall is a very, very modest attempt to try and fulfill a big dream that he carried. And it's very hard to extricate him from that. And there's two other small parts to it. One is that based on my own upbringing, like I was saying, obviously we've been exposed to that. But then when I was at LUMS, I don't know if they still call it the S Proj, but when I was in my senior year and I was doing the senior year project, which was being supervised by Dr. Ali Khan, I sort of spoke to him about, I said, well, I want to do something that lies at the intersection of fiction and anthropology. Both threads really spoke to me. And I owe so much of this to him because he was willing to take on the risk with that experiment to say, I said, can I do a short novella, and he said, yeah, do it. And I think that was my first experiment with trying to unearth my song and say, can storytelling be my song? But I think finally, Sadia, what sealed it for me, there were these series of instances, but then you have that one light bulb kind of luminous moment. And this was about 4 years ago. It was a winter at NYU. And I was, yes, definitely yay to Dr. Ali Khan. I mean, he's so indispensable to my journey. But I was sitting in a class at NYU, and we'd invited a headmaster from a school in the UK, and he was speaking to the students about kind of mindfulness and being immersed in the moment. And, in the hustle of tomorrow and the nostalgia of yesterday, you tend to kind of miss out the present. And he spoke to the students about, he's talking about all these things, and he quoted something that really stopped me in my tracks. He was quoting Sir Henry David Thoreau. And this is not the exact quote, but the spirit of it, I think, retains. He said something like, most men and women lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. And he said, what's your song? Like, take 5 minutes and scribble your song on a piece of paper and share it with the person sitting next to you. And in that moment, Sadia, it obviously felt very daunting to come up with, to conjure something that feels so important. It was something I know I'd been reckoning with, but that I'd been putting off. And I think it forced me to really hit the pause button and think about what my song was. We do all these things for our resume, but kind of what are we doing for the eulogy? And I think I've always been the kind of person to think about my job as beyond myself, as beyond the 9 to 5. And I think it was in that moment and that morning where the novella I wrote at LUMS, Abu's inspiration, all of that kind of culminated to say, I think storytelling is my song, and agnostic to medium. So it could be film or writing or whatever. But I think just the ability to touch people's lives through writing is probably my song. So that's kind of the backstory.
And I'm really looking forward to your next song, Saba, because the novel you wrote, it's so beautifully written. And when I was going through it, I mean, a Skyfall deals with, themes of sexuality, female desire, and LGBTQ community, and all these motives in your work, they're very radical motives. And I was thinking, that being a woman, being a brown woman, being a woman who belongs to a former colony, we also have some inner built system of self censorship. So when you were creating all these radical motifs in your storytelling, did that self, censorship interfere with your creative process? And if it did, then how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm to be honest, Sadia, I think there was, and maybe to some extent still is, a bit of nervousness when you write about issues related to Pakistan in general, but I think especially when you write about women. And I think I grew up, despite the privilege and all of that, despite going to a private elite school, you grow up with this sense of certain things just being spoken of in whispers, and this idea of especially female desire and female sexuality really being clamped down upon. And, it goes against the grain of being a good woman and being a good girl. And I think so there was definitely nervousness and discomfort because I have family in Pakistan, and backlash can take so many forms, right? I mean, it could be a threat, it could be a ban on the book, it could be trolling, it could be a lot of things. And I don't think I operate agnostic to that, not yet anyway. But I suppose a part of me felt that we typically tend to, as you very nicely prefaced at the beginning of the talk, we tend to think of Pakistan and of Pakistani women in these cookie cutter kind of molds. So she's either the veiled, oppressed woman or she's the vile, kind of fast one. And we judge both those extremes in some sense. And I think with Skyfall, despite the nervousness, I was keen to strip open some of those boxes and kind of just allow readers to witness some of the miracles when you unchain a Pakistani woman, and to say Rania's character, even for people who haven't read it, for instance, the protagonist in the book, she's flawed and she's vulnerable and she's chaotic and imperfect, and I think that is what real women really are like. And I wanted to steer away from these sanitized arcs of black and white and good and bad and right and wrong. And but coming back to the heart of your question, I think it takes getting a little bit comfortable in your skin with doing that, and yet the practical fears of it remain. I still remember that one of the first reactions I had to the book when Bloomsbury posted about it was, oh, it wasn't directly about women, but it was about the font of the title, which you can maybe even see in the background on that thing in the
Yeah.
back, and it's written in this Sanskrit font. And somebody on social media said, take this down, it's blasphemous, just it's Allah's name written backwards. And so, I can't sit here and pretend that I'm operating agnostic to the fear and the apprehension. But I think, Sadia, fiction allows you a very interesting fabric and texture to deal with some of these sensitive issues. It's less direct. I think with Skyfall, I didn't want to hold a placard and peddle an agenda. There are ways of doing it more sort of tacitly and more tactfully, and that's kind of what I'm attempting to do with it. But I have to be honest and say the nervousness still very much prevails.
And obviously, all your points is, it's very relevant. And um, when I was reading it, it just reminded me of that article, Valila Abulaga, do Muslim women need saving? And I thought, Amin doesn't need saving at all. She's a very empowered woman. And then I was thinking that perhaps, Saba, you're writing in English and you're writing in a language that is not ours. So perhaps that language has enabled you to unlearn that self censorship to a certain extent. Because, the politics of language is also equally important. And I sometimes wonder, and this question is from purely, is coming from this place of pure curiosity, that when writers write in a language that is not theirs, in, let's say, in our case, English, which most of our population cannot read and write, so when they're writing in a language that is alien, that is foreign to them, so sometimes they have got a certain sense of audience in their head. And when you're writing in a foreign language and you have a certain sense of audience, there is a possibility that your art or craft gets compromised to a certain extent. And that use of that foreign language enables that interference and enables that compromise. So, you being a writer, what is your experience in that context? And especially when you're writing in a society which is unfortunately has become extremely polarized, and there is less sort of tolerance for a pluralistic point of view, and we are now thinking only in terms of very strict binaries of black and white.
Thank you for asking me that, Sadia, because the politics of language has really been very salient in my own mind as the process of putting Skyfall and crafting it came together. And I think I see it as kind of a two-part situation. One is that yes, I think the decision to write in English was very deliberate for me because what it offers is access, and it
Mm.
suddenly broadens my entire axis of readership. And I think that to me, and we have people like Dr. Farooq Khan on the conversation today, and I'm sure this will speak to him as well, to say that um, even in the aftermath of the book getting released, like, you realize that we don't have even 10% of the traction as storytellers from Pakistan that Indian authors do. So I think for me, writing in English was a very deliberate choice to say, am I going to be able to reach audiences beyond my home country, And it's unfortunate that unlike India, regional languages and literature in regional languages doesn't have much traction in Pakistan. So I think for me, it was very motivated by this question of, am I carving out some space for Pakistani voices? We complain about getting represented by the West a lot, but what are we doing to change that? So I think that's the reason why I sort of opted for that. But you're 100% right when you use the word compromise. And this is something, like my late father used to say, that the sign of somebody being truly educated is having kind of command over English and Urdu. Even though I grew up in a school and at a time where speaking good Urdu almost was like something to be embarrassed of, unfortunately, and that's kind of the complex that a lot of us grew up with. But I think what gets compromised in the politics of language, Sadia, is the emotional and the cultural resonance and the rubric that something like Urdu provides. And it's funny that the language at home I'll speak today with my girls, with my husband, is English mostly. And yet I feel this is a big reason why in Skyfall, Shairi is such a big part of it. And my editor at Bloomsbury said, please keep the original language for poetry in Urdu and then give a translation for global audiences. But, being someone who's read like translations of Manto's short stories in English, I find it like crushing. And it loses the spirit and it loses the essence. And I feel it's unfortunate that we don't have a lot of complete novels coming out in Urdu, because even though we may not speak it a lot, there's a certain context and connotation that just cannot be carried out with the translation. And I definitely think that's a pity. What might be different though is that when somebody's sitting, or when someone who doesn't know Urdu, who's never spoken Urdu reads that poetry for the first time in English, they maybe don't come with that kind of context. And so it's okay for them. But I 100% feel that, you lose something. Yes, I think you can be braver in English because, your audiences back home are a little more limited. So the ability to kind of make those artistic choices is obviously, you can be more courageous with it. But I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, to be honest.
Yes, we have got one comment and question from Dr. Ali, so I'm going to read it out.
Sure.
Saba, I remember your senior project very well. 80,000 words of wonderful written work. I still have it. From there, you went to Oxford, you have got married, motherhood, teaching, documentary, filmmaking, and a novel. From all those varied experiences, what advice would you give to aspiring writers?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, sir. Thank you so much. Um, I guess, what I would say is I would probably go back to what I said about the song. And the reason why I say that is that I wish somebody, or not somebody, I guess I say this to the younger version of myself. It's never too late, but I guess if students are listening in, what I would say, which they are, I would say that for a while it's probably really valuable in the chaos and the hustle of our everyday. I remember my own time at LUMS, like pulling nighters, trying to get those GPAs sorted, trying to keep your scholarship. I think just taking out a little bit of time to think about what one song is and how you want to really pay it forward, I think that would probably be the advice that I would give. And allied to that, again, goes back to this idea of often we don't think enough about the present. And to me, that's a very important lesson that I've learned over time, to say there's worry about tomorrow and there's always regrets about yesterday. But this point to say, eventually for me it was the headmaster's words. It could be anything for anyone else, but the point kind of being, everything that Dr. Ali Khan has put in the chat right now is true. Like, I found myself on this treadmill for the last decade and a half to say, there's two girls I've had back to back. There's been the job, there's been a home to take care of, there's been marriage, and then we have this vaulting ambition. And the point kind of being, can we hit pause just for a little bit to kind of have that conversation with ourselves and say, what about the eulogy? I think that for me is something that's very close to my heart. And that's probably the advice I would give. The only other little thing that I will add to that, and I do this because I also really want to register the role that Lums has played in my trajectory. I've said it in a lot of interviews I've now done post the book. But amidst a plethora of things that Lums gave me, I think the biggest gift that Lums gave me was that it unlocked my mind. And this question you asked me about writing for women, or that Dr. Ali Khan is asking about advice, it's like it normalized asking questions to otherwise a very passive situation, and the fact that it's okay to actually critically think. I still remember sitting in Professor Farooq Khan's class. It was a literature of conflict class. And we were sitting in one of those auditoriums, and he put up this slide on the projector. It was a black and white slide. It was a painting, a sketch or a painting and I can't remember exactly what it was, but he said, look at this painting and respond to it and just react to it. Write me 3 lines, write me a paragraph, 10 minutes, just respond. And I remember feeling a gamut of emotions. I was petrified. I was surprised. I was like, is this what pedagogy looks like? Like, can we be this creative? And I was one of the people he called upon to read my response. And it just really, really broadened my horizons to say, ask questions instead of just constantly seeking answers. And I think that's why the characters in my book today are great. So that's probably the other piece of advice that I would give, which is to say, being people of brown origin, especially women, we're often taught not to ask questions and critically think. And I think there is something like a beautiful brown mind, and just embracing that and being courageous enough to unleash it and harness it is the advice I would give. Very long-winded answer, sir, but that's kind of, I guess how I see it.
Thank you very much, Saba. I've got another question because the tale you are telling, it's a difficult tale to tell, and there are some very heart-wrenching scenes in Skyfall. So is it possible for you, being a creator and being a writer, to maintain some kind of a distance with those characters, with those situations when you're creating those difficult scenes, or it's not possible? You get involved there too. I think the question I'm trying to ask, is it possible to maintain some kind of objectivity or neutrality when we are creating situations, difficult one, when we are creating characters, complex one?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, writing scenes of, say, violence against women, for example, were some of the most gut-wrenching scenes. They were the
Mhm.
hardest to write. And I think it's not easy to maintain distance because you go through draft after draft, and in the end, you stop counting how many drafts you have. But I almost feel like at one point for me, Sadia, especially because I'm not trained in creative writing and I don't have like an MFA, I don't have access to an inner circle as such. I think for me, it was very much about embracing that complexity and that mess and that chaos, and saying, I think it's okay to be immersed in that world that you're trying to create. And I don't think one needs to necessarily be apologetic, because at the end, I want a voice that's discernible. And that voice doesn't have to be, I'm not saying right or wrong, good or bad, it's literally emotions that one is trying to convey. I think speaking about the craft and talking about particularly difficult scenes and characters, I tried to almost show them like vignettes of a film reel. I thought about it as a film a lot, or as visual imagery a lot, and adopted the stance to say, let less be more. So I'm going to show everything that is violent or gut wrenching, but I'm not going to tell my reader how to interpret or how to feel about this scene. Like, that golden rule of show, don't tell. And different people, I've been part of book clubs post the release, and different people have reacted so differently to a variety of aspects in the book. And I think that's thrilling. That's exactly what you want to do with it. But I think the question speaks to something even more consequential, Sadia, which is to say, especially for some of your students, for instance, who maybe think about storytelling later on. For the longest time, I kept thinking, oh, I don't have an MFA. Like, am I thinking about writing a book? Where is that song coming from? And one thing that one big takeaway for me was becoming comfortable with what you said about the complexity and the mess and the chaos. And people crave this typical sanitized arc of kind of start to finish, knowing everything. And today I've had a lot of readers react to me and say, it's beautiful that Skyfall reads in such a raw manner. And I take that as a big compliment, because I think I wanted to take people backstage and say, this was the raw material I used. This is what it looked like. And I think the closest analogy I draw is to music. So if I listen to, say, Faiz's poetry, or I listen to an Abda Parveen song or a Nusrat Fateh Ali song, it's complex and it's messy and it's so much in there. And at the end, the experience of listening to it is you can still distill the simplicity of a folk song from it. And I think that's what I wanted to do with these complex, messy characters and these scenes of violence and that sort of thing.
Cheers, thank you. I've got three questions from students. One is from Arifa Zahoor, and she's asking, did studying social anthropology help you in writing your novel? Yeah, clearly.
300%. Sorry, go ahead, Sadia.
No, what I was saying that you already answered that, your dissertation, your senior project was actually the starting point of that song which you wrote in Skyfall.
Yeah. And Satya, I would probably, it definitely was. I think that was really the inception, and the fact that somebody said, do this. And I mean, before that, before I had that chat with Dr. Ali Khan, I didn't realize completely that there can be a kind of multidisciplinary approach. It's like we learn to write and kind of speak in these silos of disciplines to say, oh, well, that's creative writing, that's literature, that's anthropology. And I think he made me realize that they can be conversant with one another. So that was definitely the start. But also, when it came to the, people often ask me, like, what was the research process like for
Yeah.
Skyfall? And I think that ties into the question your student is asking, to say, well, I don't have research in terms of, oh, I went and interviewed 30 people the way I might for an anthropological project or an ethnography. But the the time that I spent in Lahore, on those streets and those alleys, the anthropologist in me, kind of the people watcher, I think that informs a lot of your storytelling, and the fact that you learn to embrace a variety of perspectives. And so, especially for me, Sadia, I was writing about a world that is very distant from mine. I mean, Hira Mandi stands at a complete departure from my own comfort zone. And there's always this danger of being really voyeuristic and kind of exoticizing and dumbing down these women. And I remember there was for one of my classes at LUMS that I had researched this area. And a lot of that has informed the character of Rania, for instance, to say she's got dreams, she's got aspirations, and it stems from that anthropological lens that I used to talk to them back in the day. So I definitely feel it's hard to extricate one from the other.
Cheers, thank you. I've got another question from Vakas Manzoor, and he's asking, do you have any plan to get it translated, the book, into Urdu? Because I feel it should be accessible to the mainstream people. Yeah, that's a question.
Yes, well, Vikas, thank you for that beautiful suggestion. And I definitely had translation on my mind, hopefully, in a number of languages. But I think Urdu is very high on that priority list. Though I have to disclaim it with two things. One is that the quality of translation can make such a big difference, right? So kind of not to have someone do a shorthand version of it. And so I think just to get someone who's willing to crystallize the spirit of the book. And the second thing, which is kind of the more controversial thing to say, but I'll still say it, is that I don't know what the readership is like anymore. And that shouldn't stop me from getting it translated. But I feel that unfortunately, Urdu literature has, it's quite a niche. And I hope that changes. And I hope that we have some kind of a renaissance, given what a rich tapestry we have of Urdu literature and culture in this part of the world. But it would definitely be something that I would be very keen to explore. Yes. Thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you, Saba. We've got another question from Dr. Farooq Khan, and he's asking, how does it feel to see people having a completely or at odds interpretation of what you have set forth in your book?
Well, sir, it's thrilling sometimes. I think I have had that. Like I was at a book club in Abu Dhabi, and a couple of people reacted to particular parts of the book in ways that I never thought of while writing it. But I think that's really the beauty of the creative process, right? Like, I put it together with like an experiment in a lab, like throwing all these things into the mix. And then, you put it out in the universe and people read it in different ways. I think, I think I have to say though that if someone completely misunderstood the spirit of the book, like the abstract spirit and the more philosophical spirit behind the book, that would probably be the less exciting reaction. But when there are parts to the suspense and the thrill and the characters that get read in a different way, then I think I find that to be very thrilling. And I'll tell you why. That I feel like it's a very co-creative process. Like, I remember reading one of Mohsin Hamid's interviews, and he said, I find the novel as an invitation for someone to come and dance with me. And I think that's beautiful because you've got your imagination and you've got words on a paper, and you can make what you want of it. And so I feel like it really allows a kind of license and a freedom that we often don't get when someone tells us how to think about something. So most of the times it's very rewarding to see people so immersed and kind of giving it an interpretation that maybe you didn't even think of. Yeah, it's exciting.
Thank you, Saba. There's another question from a student, Ayman Behzad. And she's asking, since we are in a pandemic, how difficult is it to find our own song since we have so much time on our hands and it's a stressful time?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Amen, thanks for that question. And I think it's been a harrowing, bizarre kind of year and continues to be that. And I think I'm really not trying to sugarcoat this. People ask me what was the experience like of kind of editing and publishing the work during a pandemic as well. And it was very, very difficult. So I'm not going to try and water that down. But I think the foil to that, and especially for students, what I would say is that if one does find that you're kind of more closeted in a physical space, for example, or if there is more time on your hands. I didn't find more time on my hands, I guess, because I've got two very small girls and everything else going on. But if one does just find, let me just say, not even the time, but just when the surround sound, that deafening surround sound, when that sort of, I think, dilutes a little bit, then I almost do feel like it gives you that space to hit pause, right? And it almost, a lot of people did say this, that despite how crushing the last year has been, and loss and all of that and grief, it has also been a time for reflection. And I feel unearthing one's song is very much about connecting with yourself and saying, what drives me and how do I want to touch people's lives. And so I'm not saying it's easy to do it at any point, not particularly during a pandemic, but if you do feel that's been a time for added reflection, then I feel that's the first step to really trying to unearth your song. Because for me, I think the fear was, there'll always be the bills at the end of the month, the paycheck, your academics, your GPAs, everything will always pose an obstruction. The pandemic, of course, front and center. But I guess I just kept imagining myself at the end of life, kind of with this visual of, oh my God, like I wanted to do this, that, the other. And I was kind of also tired of sitting at the margins and applauding other people do things that I was hoping to do. So I think that's one part of it, Eamon. And the other practical part of it is just to get started. Like the other day, I watched a video where someone said there's two kinds of people. One person is going to be the sort who'll say, oh, I need to have the feeling. Like I really need to feel like I found my song, and then I'll move and I'll take action. And the other kind of person is the one who'll say, I need to move, and that's when things will start happening. And I think kind of belonging to the latter set and really starting to put pen to paper or whatever it is that drives you, actioning it can be a very gratifying experience.
Thank you very much, Saba, for such a thorough answer. I've got another question from Fatima Azim, and she's asking, we are reading Black Milk by Alif Shafak, and that book deals with motherhood, marriage, and writing, and trying to reconcile these three aspects of a woman's life and the societal expectations that come with it. How would you say you have been impacted by them, and how have you managed to reconcile the three, how the former two have influenced the latter?
So, Sadia, that was motherhood, and what were the other two?
Motherhood, marriage, and writing.
Yeah.
But Aleph Shafak talks about, motherhood, marriage, and writing as a kind of a harem where all these things sort of interact with each other.
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually just reading the 40 Rules of Love as well, and kind of halfway through it. But thank you for that question. I think I started out with a very different stance on this. And I think in the early years of my marriage, for instance, I was like, oh, I can't even imagine thinking about having kids because what's going to happen to my career. And I think it's very important for me to be honest with, especially the students, about this because you realize over time how you have to unlearn these things we're taught to believe in these stereotypes. And I think over time, Sadia, my own experience has shown me that there's a way that the three can kind of coexist. And again, not to take away the practical constraints of that. It's crazy, right? So I'll be stuffing food into like my daughter's mouth and thinking about a talk I need to do or about grading that needs to get done. And so none of that is easy. But at the end, I think what I have done in a lot of my storytelling is actually I've drawn upon those experiences to kind of think about marriage and motherhood. And I guess the small little one that I will share amongst a lot of others is that when we had our second daughter, I remember when I was expecting her, I got stopped by someone at NYU, and somebody asked me, so you're having another baby. Do you know the gender? And I said, yeah, we're having a girl. And she sort of gave me this very the reaction was almost like a condolence, and it was like, oh, again. That's all she said. She said again, and kind of had this crestfallen expression. And I think initially it sparked within me anger to say kind of how dare you, but subsequently I think I've learned to kind of make meaning out of those moments and say, how do you turn that into some, how do you use art and storytelling to turn those kinds of moments into something meaningful and to galvanize. And so I feel like the three things now definitely speak to each other. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about, because when you see them as mutually exclusive, it becomes very limiting. So I'm glad I've kind of learned to embrace a lot of times the messiness and kind of chaos that comes with it as well. But
It
it's
reminds
an essential part of my identity, and I can't extricate motherhood or marriage from storytelling or writing.
It just reminded me of a Nigerian British author, Buchia Macheta. And she, in one of her interviews, she said that she's a writer because she's a mother. And she doesn't look at these things as something which are opposing to each other. Rather, she argues that her motherhood sort of strengthens her writing. And Aleph Shafak also talks about in a similar vein in Black Milk that it is her motherhood which has enabled her to write so profoundly. So thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. Another question from a student, Monema Zahid, and she's asking how did the experience of being a Pakistani woman shape your novel and Rania's character? And also, where can we buy your book in Pakistan? I think Liberty Books is selling your book. Yeah.
Yeah, Liberty's got the book, and I think it's on Kindle as well, but I'm not sure if you can access it in Pakistan on Kindle, but it's at Liberty Books. With I think my experience as a Pakistani woman is at the heart of Skyfall, and I will add the caveat to say it's not at all autobiographical, and I think I was conscious of that because as a debut author, that can be tempting. So I think what I've done is I've parked her character, or let me say, I've placed it in a world that is at such a distance from mine that it couldn't be autobiographical. But yet I feel so many scenes and vignettes are part of my story and possibly the story of so many of us women and girls who've grown up in parts of Pakistan and who continue to live there. And I think with Rania's character, it goes back to where Sadia began the conversation to say, I think I was, I grew up in Karachi, my life was constantly kind of wrought with these daily battles, at that time, again, of be seen and not heard so much. Lums changed a lot of that, of course, but then that came like at a later point in time. And I think I think eventually, when it all these years later, when it came to storytelling, I realized that it's going to be very intimately bound with a lot of those issues that we used to speak of just in whispers. Now, I guess what I want to though highlight is that I struggle a little bit with women's representation in South Asian literature, whether it's coming from a Western voice or whether it's coming from a local voice. And the reason why, with Rania's character, I wanted to explore the gray a little bit was that, again, I didn't want it to seem aggressive and defensive for the sake of being aggressive. Because I think a lot of times feminist hues in a country like Pakistan can become sort of, all you see empowerment as is in these loud and fierce tones. And I think with Rania's character, of course, she's loud in lots of parts, but she's also quietly fierce and compelling in other parts. And I think I wanted to draw audiences into this world of Pakistani women, where empowerment can take on a different shape and color and language, and where I don't need to have a placard and be shouting from a rooftop to have my voice heard. And so I think that's kind of the experience I've had growing up, and somewhere it's really informed, I think, the kind of character that I wanted to build out. Her mother's character, for instance, again, is one of those where it's not the number of scenes she has, or it's not the fact that she's constantly protesting, but there are these particular scenes where, even at the book club, people said to me, she suddenly, that motherhood, coming back to the conversation about motherhood, the power of motherhood and that maternal instinct which you preserve for these particular crises suddenly ascends. And to me, that's powerful and beautiful. And I just wanted to go beyond our Western constructs of what an empowered woman can look like. And again, my time in Lahore showed me that we tend to dumb down women from the so-called margins. They've got agency, and they're empowered, but maybe not in the ways that we expect them to be.
In African feminism, they have this alternative term to Western feminism, and they call it motherism, because for them, being a mother is also a very empowering thing. So we have another question from Ariana Kamal, and she's asking, so you said that your personal life is very different from that of the characters. What was the most difficult part of trying to authentically take that on?
Yeah. And this kind of ties back to the question you asked me about, does the anthropologist in you speak to the writer in you? Because whilst the decision to keep her as hailing from Hira Mandi was deliberate, and there were reasons for that, and I was interested in that part of Lahore, I think it's very dangerous to do that without some kind of empirical exploration of that culture and of that world. And I think the days and nights that I spent at Lums and that I spent in Lahore are very, very central to the writing of Skyfall. I have these really sort of vivid and almost visceral impressions of the streets and alleys of Old Lahore. And I think, Sadia, what I've tried to do is I've tried to use place almost as a protagonist in the book. And especially when it comes to Lahore, I was keen to show a part of Lahore and people from these neighborhoods in ways that are not sanitized, that are completely rough around the edges, and that are not touristy, that are not playing to a typical Western gallery. And I think for that, it was important to have had those conversations with these women, and it was important to have really spent time in those parts, and so you don't think of it as research when you're doing it necessarily. But I think had that not happened, I would really struggle to write a book that is at such a distance from my own world.
Yes, thank you. Saba, there is another question from a student, Maruf Murad, and she's asking, there has been a lot of discussion about how vocabulary has adapted to the pandemic. There are multiple phrases that have cropped up, such as feeling zoomed out and hosting Zoom parties, among others. How do you think storytelling has adapted to our current context? And how will it continue to be affected given the dynamics of our linguistic sensibilities are evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I realized some months ago Zoom fatigue is so real, right? And you realize that it's a thing. But I also feel like, again, like it's all happening as we speak. But to me personally, and I think a lot of this is based out of my experience at NYU, that there's again a certain access that it's provided to work and stories which often didn't reach the fore before this. And of course, technology was a big part of kind of our fabric prior to this, but it suddenly opened up, a lot of other windows into different parts of the world. For example, my colleagues from Africa, I mean, that was a part of the world that I honestly didn't have too much access or knowledge about before this. And suddenly they're there back home, and kind of sharing their vocabulary, their syntax, kind of what's going on in their world. So I think in that sense, it's definitely an upside. But again, I always fear answering something about the pandemic in an overly sugar-coated way, because I think it's been a very tough year, and there's no denying that. But somehow, and especially during lockdown, I remember this, based off my own experience as well. The fact that things slowed down a little bit allowed people, I think, to connect, to kind of draw connections with stories and with themselves in a way that maybe wasn't happening earlier. We saw that with things like the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw it with so many other things. I mean, I myself have contributed to this really powerful collection of stories, on mothering and COVID. And the kind of the question about vocabulary and language, kind of, and how it's adapted, it's literally like not necessarily a super academic volume, but it's people's human experiences, and it's emotive, and people don't have to be apologetic about writing from an emotional standpoint. I think that's what the pandemic has done, and I think there's something to say for that.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Saba. And now we've got another very interesting question from another student, Fasi Bilal. And he's saying, as we had many conversations with our instructor regarding the preservation of originality of the text, especially poetry when it is translated, was this on your mind whilst you kept the poetry parts in Urdu? Do you think if a bilingual approach is employed by authors to express themselves makes them more relatable to their audience, or does it limit the comprehension of the text just to a certain part of the audience? So
Yeah.
politics of translation, it's.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to the translation question. But for me and my editor, I think, kind of took me to this. It was really important to keep Urdu poetry in its original language. And of course, you kind of don't want to alienate a global audience. So there's a translation right below it, with every piece of poetry that's offered. But part of it was that, part of it is also personal, because I've kind of been exposed to Urdu prose and poetry from a very young age, but also at LUMS with people like Dr. Arifa Sayyida Zehra, and sitting in her classes. And I feel for me, it would have been a very difficult decision to only go with the translation, especially when it came to poetry. Again, I think this goes back to the point that it's intangible. I think the emotional and cultural part of it is very intangible, and I feel a lot gets lost in translation, and it feels like an abridged form. And so it's all right maybe to write the whole book in English, but the parts that originally, especially a lot of the poetry belongs to fairs, and I find it crushing to have to translate that, or to only translate that. So I've kind of gone with a safer sort of thing that satisfies me, and that also works for a more global audience.
Thank you very much, Saba. There's another question from a student, anonymous attendee, but the question is suggesting perhaps it's from my harem class. And so you have created a space for the margins to be represented, and you have done some of the hushing we are subjected to. How do you picture representation going forward? Do you think your daughters will be subject to such hushing, if at all?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And it's something that's, been on my mind as well. As I was thinking about this conversation with all of you today, I was thinking, my own time at LUMS was like a decade and a half ago. So, I wonder if things for the students today have changed. And I guess they have, and they haven't both. And my answer would be to say, I hope the needle has begun to move. But then the question that always, or the caution I kind of give to myself when saying that is that you and me, Sadia, are a sliver, and my daughters are a sliver of Pakistani society. And I always feel like, kind of, this is why even in the book I didn't want to speak for people from Hira Mandi. I wanted to kind of say their story but not claim any kind of representation. And whilst I hope that somewhere we begin to normalize conversations around women's sexuality, women's desire, I think living an anti-desire life is just, it's not human, right? It's antithetical to being human. But I still feel that there is such a politics to it, right? Be that religious, be that negative social sanctioning, be that our own parents, right? So in my own example, for instance, with my, despite what I would like to believe was a progressive family setup, my parents were not keen to send me to LUMS just because it involved going from Karachi to Lahore. And it took a lot of convincing on the part of my brother to do that. And so today I write about these things and it sounds strange, but whilst I hope my daughters kind of inhabit a world where there is, where the needle has moved, I guess we've got a lot of unlearning to do, and I think there's a very strong kind of cultural and religious underpinning, which is going to take. I think it's going to take time, and again, this goes back to that idea of movements kind of having stages. And when we try and parachute something in from the West and say, "Oh, let's bring in Me Too," and things should suddenly transform overnight, I take objection to that because I just don't know if the woman working in my mother's house will have the tools to understand that. So whilst I'm hopeful and I hope that movement from darkness to light is happening, I think I also don't want to sound over utopian about it.
Thank you very much, Saba. Dr. Farooq has a question. Saba, I had a question about how your time at LAMS might have made it into the novel.
So thank you for that question. I was hoping someone asked that. I think in two ways. The first is sort of, I think, more literally the time at Lums and the time at Lahore. And I think, again, it's so interesting that in Pakistan, ethnicity is such a big place, such a big part in our identities. And it's like the first thing you'll say is, "Oh, I'm from Karachi, I'm from Lahore, I'm Punjabi, I'm Sindhi," and before you say you're Pakistani. And so I think coming to Lahore from Karachi, I wasn't expecting to have this kind of love affair with the city, to be honest. But it's my time at LUMS, and it's practically, I think, a lot of those days and those nights that have made their way into the book. I was, I guess, that's the reason why I chose to base the book out of Lahore instead of, say, my own home city. And I feel like LUMS in Lahore exudes so much character and so much, I don't know, just so much culture, that's something that I miss in Karachi. And I feel like historically as well, just as a city, Lahore boasts that. And that's played a really big part. But the other way that LUMS has played a huge role in informing storytelling in the book in particular is kind of what I said. Yes, Lahore is love. Absolutely, it is. Um, I think has to do with the fact that, Sadia, I attended a private school, in a private British school in Karachi, right? A school with a British curriculum. And then after that, I kind of journeyed to LUMS. And I think the minute you enter the gates of LUMS, something quite interesting happens. You suddenly realize that these barriers of kind of class and ethnicity and all the other kind of socially constructed barriers that we have start to shed away, which is very different from the experience that I had at school, where I was probably one of, I don't know, I'd like to say three people in my class who was middle class. Everybody else was like hailing from a very elite pedigree. And I think LUMS changed that for me. And LUMS made me realize I'm going to be sitting alongside people from all parts of Pakistan. I'm going to be sitting alongside people from a variety of socioeconomic classes. And just to be able to welcome their perspectives and give them the kind of weightage. And this kind of then ties into the book to say that I've written about a world which is very different from mine without dumbing it down. And if it wasn't for that kind of opening of the mind and broadening of the horizons and just saying, going back to that idea of critical thinking and asking questions more than seeking answers, I don't think I would ever have written Skyfall. So, and I kind of deliberately also mentioned this, Adia, because for students listening in, I think maybe that's changed today, like a decade and a half later, but I still feel in Pakistan there are enough forces working counter to that process of questioning and critical thinking. And it's interesting because I went to Oxford after that, and I would imagine that that would have been the place where my mind opened, but it wasn't a patch on the experience at LUMS. So it's in one word, it's indispensable to my journey.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Saba. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Um, I think I just have this last question. You are trained as an anthropologist, right? And now you are this wonderful creative author. So, how was this transition? Was it painful or was it exhilarating?
I think I see it again as I don't see it as mutually exclusive, and I think so. I guess I embrace both parts of both
Yeah.
of those labels today. And so the answer would be definitely exhilarating, but with the caveat that it's not an either or. So today I'm still the same person who's going to be, like I'm the anthropologist in me is working on kind of ethnographic data with young Afghani men, and jihad and religion and how that features in. And I'm the same person who's then gone ahead and written this book. So I feel like the anthropological lens informs a lot of my storytelling. And I guess it all kind of ties in under the canvas and the label of storyteller, which is the one label that I embrace quite happily. So, yes, exhilarating for sure.
Thank you very much, Saba. And I think we feel privileged that you have shared your storytelling and your song with us. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much, everyone, for your excellent questions and your input. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And thank you to Dr. Ali Khan and Dr. Farooq Khan as well. I'm so grateful. Thank you very much, Sadia.
Thank you, Saba. Take care. Have a good
All
evening.
right. Have a lovely
Bye.
evening. Bye bye.
Bye.